A man who once commanded 80,000 warriors walks through the streets of Rome in 46 BC, his hands bound in golden chains and his neck carrying a placard that lists his crimes as defending his homeland. Around him, 1,000,000 Romans are screaming, not in anger, but in celebration. And this man has been kept alive for 6 years, specifically for this moment. 6 years in a dark cell beneath the city, waiting, because Rome didn't just want to defeat Vercingetorix, the king who united Gaul against them. They wanted to parade him, and they wanted his people, watching from the crowd as slaves, to see their legendary warrior reduced to a prop in someone else's victory party. 2 hours from now, he'll be dead, strangled in a basement while the celebrations continue above. But here's the thing about the Roman triumph. Execution wasn't the point, humiliation was the point, and execution was just cleanup. Rome didn't conquer the ancient world through military superiority alone. They built a psychological system so sophisticated that kings would surrender rather than face it, and at the center of that system sat a ceremony so calculated in its cruelty that it makes modern propaganda look amateur. This is what Rome really did to the rulers who defied them, and it was designed to break far more than just one man. Before we walk through the blood and gold of a Roman triumph, you need to understand what made it different from any victory celebration before or since. Every empire celebrates victory, and the Persians held feasts while the Greeks erected monuments and the Egyptians carved conquests into temple walls. Rome turned celebration into psychological warfare. The triumph wasn't a party. What Rome built was a precisely engineered ritual designed to accomplish 3 things simultaneously, which were rewarding the general, legitimizing the war, and psychologically destroying anyone who might consider resisting Rome in the future. A general who won a significant victory could petition the Senate for a triumph, and the requirements were specific. At least 5,000 enemy dead, the war conclusively ended and the general's command officially concluded. Senate approval unlocked the funds and set the date, and that's when the procession planning began. The route was fixed along the Via Triumphalis, winding through Rome's most densely populated neighborhoods before ascending the Capitoline Hill to the Temple of Jupiter. Every citizen became an audience member, and every street became a stage. But what made this strategic, rather than merely celebratory, was the rigid structure of the procession order, where every element communicated a specific message. Spoils came first, wagons loaded with captured gold, silver, weapons, artwork, and sacred objects stolen from enemy temples rolled through the streets, arranged not randomly, but to tell a story. Placards identified each item's origin, while paintings depicted conquered cities, and the message to the crowd was impossible to miss. Captives came second, and this is where Rome's psychological genius becomes undeniable. The prisoners weren't just marched through Rome, they were curated. Defeated generals walked in chains with captured nobles following behind them, and women and children of royal families stumbled along the cobblestones while Romans jeered at them. But at the front of this procession of the broken, positioned for maximum visibility, walked the kings. Rome kept defeated rulers alive specifically for the triumph, sometimes for years. Vercingetorix spent 6 years in the Tullianum prison, kept breathing for the sole purpose of being displayed, and Jugurtha, the Numidian king who had humiliated Roman armies for years, was held until Gaius Marius could properly parade him. These men weren't prisoners awaiting trial, they were props being stored until the show was ready. When the day arrived, these kings were dressed carefully, not in rags because that would make Rome look like. They defeated beggars, but often in their royal garments with their crowns and their symbols of office intact. The message was precise. This man was powerful, this man was a king, and now he walks in chains behind a Roman general's chariot. Contemporary accounts describe the reactions of captured royalty during these processions, with some walking stoically and refusing to show emotion, while others wept openly, and a few had to be physically supported by guards because their legs wouldn't carry them. Perseus of Macedon, the last king of the Antigonid dynasty, reportedly begged to be spared the humiliation of the triumph and sent messages to his captor, Aemilius Paulus, pleading for a private execution instead. Paulus's response, recorded by Plutarch, amounted to this: "You could have avoided this by dying in battle, but you chose to surrender, and now you'll walk." Perseus walked, and his children walked beside him. The procession began outside the city walls at the Campus Martius, where captives were held in a staging area and organized into their positions and inspected to ensure they looked appropriately defeated but not so broken they'd collapse before the route was complete. And that's when the march began. The Via Triumphalis stretched approximately 4 miles, which meant 4 miles of walking through crowds specifically assembled to mock you, 4 miles of Romans pointing and laughing and throwing things, 4 miles of your name being chanted not in honor but in ridicule. Contemporary sources describe the sounds as trumpets blaring and drums pounding and the crowd roaring, with the rattling of chains underneath it all. The route wound through the Circus Flaminius, past the Theatre of Marcellus, through the Forum Boarium with its cattle markets, into the Roman Forum itself, which was the political heart of the Republic, and finally up the Capitoline Hill. That elevation change was part of the design, forcing exhausted captives to struggle upward while the crowd watched from below, and every stumble was visible, and every moment of weakness was public. At the Temple of Jupiter, the procession paused while the general ascended to make offerings, and the spoils were ceremonially dedicated, and the crowd cheered. The captive kings were led away from the celebration, down into the darkness beneath the Capitoline Hill, into the Tullianum. Most histories gloss over what happened next, because the triumph didn't end with celebration, it ended with abasement. The Tullianum, sometimes called the Mamertine Prison, was Rome's oldest and most notorious detention facility, and it wasn't a prison in the modern sense with long-term cells or rehabilitation programs or appeals processes. It was a hole where Rome put people it wanted to erase. The structure still exists today beneath the Church of San Giuseppe dei Falegnami, and archaeologists have mapped its layout as 2 chambers stacked vertically. The upper chamber was accessible by a single door, but the lower chamber, the Tullianum proper, was accessible only through a hole in the floor. Prisoners were lowered through that hole into complete darkness, and the chamber measured roughly 6.5 feet high with no ventilation, no light, and no sanitation, with the floor often waterlogged from underground springs. This is where Vercingetorix spent his final hours, and this is where Jugurtha was left to starve or strangle depending on which sources you trust. And this is where Perseus of Macedon and his children were held after the triumph. But here's the calculated part. The executions were timed. While the general received honors at the Temple of Jupiter, while the crowd celebrated, while Rome congratulated itself on another conquered enemy, below their feet in the darkness, the defeated king was being killed. The method varied between strangulation and the garrote, and prisoners simply being thrown into the lower chamber and left until they stopped breathing. What didn't vary was the synchronization, because the death was meant to coincide with the ceremony above, and as Jupiter received his offerings, the enemy king received his ending. Now step back and look at what Rome actually built here, because this wasn't bloodlust and it wasn't even revenge. This was a communication system. Every element of the triumph was designed to send messages to specific audiences simultaneously. Roman citizens received the message that their army was invincible and their generals delivered wealth and their city was the center of the world. Potential enemies received the message that this is what resistance looks like, because this king had armies and wars and alliances and none of it mattered, and now he walked in chains and now he's gone. Current subjects received the message that they too were once enemies and their king once walked this route, and they should remain compliant or the chains could return. The Senate received leverage over ambitious generals by making triumphs difficult to obtain and requiring their approval. Physical destruction of cities was expensive and time-consuming, but psychological destruction of enemy leadership was efficient and replicable. Rome realized that killing a king in battle made him a martyr, while parading him in chains made him a warning, and the warnings accumulated. After Aemilius Paulus triumphed over Perseus, Macedon stopped producing resistance leaders. After Julius Caesar triumphed over Vercingetorix, Gallic rebellion became sporadic and desperate. After emperor paraded captured kings from Britannia to Parthia, the message became impossible to ignore. No one is beyond Rome's reach, and no one is too important to humiliate. The triumph created a psychological template that echoed across the ancient world, and kings who heard what happened to Vercingetorix made different calculations when Roman legions appeared on their borders. Surrender early, negotiate terms, accept client status, do anything. Except force Rome to make an example of you. Variations in the formula revealed just how calculated the system really was. Zenobia, the warrior queen of Palmyra who had carved out her own empire in Rome's eastern territories, was captured by Aurelian in 272 AD and paraded in his triumph, but she wasn't executed afterward. Palmyra was a buffer state Rome actually needed, and killing Zenobia would have created a martyr and destabilized the region, which meant her fate was different by design. She was displayed in golden chains, with some sources claiming the chains were so heavy she could barely walk, and her humiliation was total and public. And then she was retired, given a villa in Tiber, allowed to live out her days in comfortable obscurity. The adjusted message was clear. Rome can destroy you or Rome can spare you, and both options exist entirely at Rome's discretion. Cleopatra understood this calculus perfectly, which explains why she never walked in a triumph. When Octavian's forces captured Alexandria, Cleopatra negotiated and delayed and ultimately chose suicide over chains, and the asp, if that's actually what killed her, was an escape from the triumph. Octavian had to settle for parading an effigy instead, and it wasn't the same, and everyone knew it wasn't the same, because Cleopatra had denied Rome its complete victory, and that denial echoed through history. The Romans were apparently so frustrated by important captives cheating the triumph through suicide that they assigned guards specifically to prevent it. The theatrical value of a living, humiliated king was worth the cost of keeping them breathing. What should disturb you about the triumph is that it worked on everyone. The general needed the triumph for political advancement because it was the ultimate credential, and without a triumph you were just another successful commander, while with a triumph you were touched by divine favor and publicly recognized as exceptional and granted a day when you were treated almost like a god. The soldiers needed the triumph for their bonuses, since triumphators distributed the spoils to their troops, and a successful triumph meant wealth distribution down to the lowest ranks. The citizens needed the triumph for their identity because it reinforced their sense of Roman exceptionalism, and every parade of conquered kings was proof that being Roman meant being on the winning side of history. Everyone had incentives to perpetuate the system. Everyone benefited from the public humiliation and quiet execution of defeated enemies, and that's what made it so durable. The triumph wasn't imposed by tyrants, it was maintained by collective investment, and the cruelty was distributed across an entire civilization. The Roman triumph continued for over 700 years, from the early republic through the late empire, and the basic formula remained unchanged throughout. Spoils, captives, celebration, execution. Names changed and scale varied, but the core, psychology persisted. Diocletian held the last traditional triumph in 3U3 AD, but the template didn't disappear. It evolved. Medieval kings processed captured rivals through their capitals. Renaissance princes commissioned paintings depicting their enemies in submission. Modern authoritarian regimes staged show trials designed to humiliate opponents before eliminating them. The technology changes, but the psychology remains. Rome didn't invent cruelty, and they didn't invent public execution, and they didn't even invent the victory parade. What they invented was the systematic integration of all three into a replicable process for psychological domination, because they understood that destroying a king's body was simple, while destroying his legend required engineering. 6 years Vercingetorix spent in darkness waiting for a single afternoon of humiliation. His execution took minutes and his parade took hours, and Rome knew exactly which one mattered more. The question isn't whether. Rome was cruel because that's obvious, and every empire runs on violence. The question is, what happens to a civilization that turns cruelty into ceremony, that makes humiliation into something families bring their children to watch, that synchronizes execution with celebration until the two become inseparable? Rome's triumph was honest in a way modern power rarely is. They didn't hide what they were doing. They decorated it and scheduled it and made it the highlight of the social calendar. And that honesty might be the most disturbing part, because it means 1 million Romans across 7 centuries watched kings strangled beneath their feet and called it entertainment. Some systems are built to hide what power actually costs. Rome built a system to display it. And that's not ancient history. That's a blueprint, and blueprints have a way of being rediscovered. If you want to understand how power actually works, not the version in textbooks, but the version that echoes across centuries, subscribe, because the patterns repeat. They just change costumes.